For people who are unaware, this question is in reference to an individual who has been speaking about this perspective for pretty much his entire public involvement time frame. His name is Krishnamurti, and the original video where this question came to my mind is linked in the description. So if you haven't heard that yet and you would like to see where I'm coming from that particular perspective, then go ahead and check that out and come back. But I think I'll do a pretty good job in breaking it down because I've been listening to his perspective for some years now, and it was a big part of the reason why I was even able to take a vow of silence. The driving force behind that decision was coming from gaining the ability to let go of a lot of these spiritual belief systems that in most cases are extra. In most cases, they're tools. I've been sharing the perspective of the so-called New Age community, pretty much making a business out of spiritual tools. And from my perspective, what UG breaks down is that spirituality, spiritualism, spiritual teachings in general is a tool. No different than the tool of meditation, the tool of psychedelics, the tool of crystals, the tool of the New Age community, the New Age identity itself. They're all tools. They're all things that we have to interpret, have to make a part of our reality for something else. And a lot of the times that something else can be dealt with from a deeper perspective if we allow ourselves to let go of the things that we believe are of a deeper perspective. And sometimes more complex is not necessarily deeper. It's not a more intelligent way to approach a situation or a perspective. The New Age community makes its business from making the so-called spiritual approach to reality more complex. You could argue making it more simpler to some degree, but the overall identity behind the money-making side and the spiritual teacher, being seen as a spiritual teacher side of that reality, is mostly from making it more complex. Look at the different angles, the different gurus, the different spiritual teachers, the different approaches. If the individual would let go a lot of the things that are unnecessary for their so-called spiritual progression, a lot of the problems that they have wouldn't even be there. And that's the biggest part that happens when people go into the New Age community. They start to develop different problems and more complex problems because they have more complex perspectives of reality. And that's pretty much at the basis of what UG shares when he speaks. He says in more ways than one that it's the desire to be more spiritual. It's the desire to be more of a complex spiritual student and spiritual teacher. That desire is at the center of the spiritual diseases, the spiritual pain, the discomfort that comes from constantly needing to be more spiritual, to be more of something else. It keeps you away from being who you are right now. The simplicity, the spiritual nature, the so-called spiritual nature of the simplicity, the complexity of the mind without needing the overcomplexity of being a soul, being a spirit, being interdimensional being an indigo or rainbow, or having all these expectations on who you are as an individual because of the time frame that you were born here. Like, you were born into a situation, so it makes you this. Now you have this requirement to be this kind of thing, this kind of, you're supposed to interact in the world because of this. it's a form, from my perspective, all of these things are forms that actually anchor you more into the experience overall, which is just as damaging as a spiritual con artist who's consciously spiritually conning other people. Because there's a difference. It's not saying, like, when I presented that poll, that question of, are all spiritual teachers con artists? It's not to say that all spiritual teachers are consciously conning the masses or conning their students. It's not to say that they're all, jerks or assholes or doing this on purpose. Not to say that there aren't spiritual con artists that are out there that do that. It's just to say that it's possible to be conning people because you yourself are you have unconsciously conned yourself. Or maybe you have consciously conned yourself and you think that by helping other people up to a certain degree, spiritually, you're not conning them. But it's in the sense that the very nature of spirituality, spiritualism, is a con. In a sense that, for the most part, like I said, the experience of being a spiritualist in a reality that isn't even a fraction of who and what you are, the individual, whatever that spark is beyond this experience. So to complexify this experience by adding all of the spiritual isms to this perspective, you're actually adding more weight to the way you exist in this experience. And that weight, no matter if the weight is made out of lead or if it's made out of spiritual air or spiritual mist, it doesn't matter. Whether it's lead weight, like the lead weight of the mainstream media, or the lead weight of the manipulated, mind-controlled public education system, you could see that as lead weight in comparison to spiritual teachings, which could be seen as like a weighted mist upon your experience. It doesn't matter. It's a weight that weighs you down. That mist can help you up to a certain degree. It can help you from getting out of the lead-weighted material diseases and controls that we put on ourselves from being a part of those communities. Yes, being lighter than lead helps you get out of the lead type of mentality. Does that make the lighter weight any less weighty? No, it's still a weight. It's a tool. And those tools, once they have done their job, once their mission has been complete, they will start to weigh you down. Your spiritual tool belt or your whatever kind of tool belt that you carry around with you will eventually start to weigh you down, because you eventually will not need to wear a tool belt and you won't need to carry around all of these tools. So these spiritual teachers, in many different ways, are validating their own belief system that you need a spiritual tool belt and you need to carry it around with you every single day. And you need to constantly refill your tool belt with spiritual teachings. And each one of those teachers is a different tool that you have in your tool belt that you use to be more spiritual, to be more enlightened, to be more awakened in this reality. When that's all bullshit. It's all extra. And that need, that's why I said that need of carrying around that tool belt is what's causing the problem. Because if you get to a certain point in your, let's say it's more about letting go than holding on to a deeper spiritual teaching. If you get to that point and you're still holding on to certain spiritual teachings, then you're actually going to be working against yourself. You're going to be counterproductive in your own maximum potential. And that counterproductivity is the moneymaker. It's where spiritual teachers, and you can even go into truthers. If people, the same with like the medical industry, if people start to heal themselves, there will be no need for spiritual teachers. There will be no need for the prescription drug business, the big pharma. They would go out of business. So making spirituality more of a priority, making it more complex, making it more of something that is at war with in a spiritual war, like the new age community versus the mainstream community, the sustainable environment people out there. It's the same thing with like the climate change, like the climate deniers versus the people who want to save the planet because global warming is killing the world and all this whole thing. It's a form of profit in many different ways for many different people. So they have to make it more complex. They have to make it, if it's not complex, if it's not forever changing, it's not going to be profitable because people aren't going to tune in anymore. They're going to see the repetition in it all. This is why truthers who are making a living or a profit off of the truth community, they in many different ways need to focus on the mainstream storyline. They need to keep their conscious perspective at a certain level in order to maintain the interest in particular stories, the stories that will forever be being pumped out by the system. If they expand their perspective beyond the need to pay attention to that system the way it's evolving all the time, then the viewers who tune into that perspective will also do that, and they will no longer have an interest of tuning into the individual anymore, their teacher, their truther, whatever it is. So this is at the core of what I was saying before about the spiritual teachers. Spiritual teachers, the very nature of a spiritual teacher needing to constantly evolve their spiritual teachings is what's causing their spiritual students disease, their discomfort, their need to be something more. Just as a truther constantly having an angsty sort of approach to what the mainstream media is doing or whatever it is, whatever perspective they're coming from, the very need for a deeper truth is causing the depths of ignorance because it's creating communities of ignorance under the guise of truth. The people have the tendency to want to be a part of a community. And if that community will never evolve itself, then the people themselves, for the most part, the smaller percentage of the people will eventually get out of that space, but the majority of people will stay in that space because it's comfortable. They need to validate their own perspectives, and they validate it by being a part of that community. So the core of that community who started with the beginnings of those teachings or trutherisms, whatever it is in the beginning, they will stay there. And over time, you will have a constant influx of people to add to that community because there will always be people leaving the lead-based, weighted consciousness, moving towards a more misty, sort of airy consciousness. There will always be this. That's what this entire experience is pretty much based upon. The point is, when you get to this point of not needing that misty weight at all, it needs to be let go of because it will start to weigh you down. You'll get soaked and waterlogged eventually. At first, you might feel great because you were dried out from the lead-based material reality, the lead-based consciousness. And you get a little bit of mist, a little spiritual mist spritzer, and you're, oh my God, this is amazing. This is so much better. This is actually refreshing as opposed to, hurting and weighing me down. But over time, that mist, that spiritual mist, that truth-based mist will collect on your body, and you will suffocate. You will become waterlogged. Your pores will be covered with this mist, and it will drown you out. It will suffocate you, and it will have the same effect on you. It'll just take longer. It'll have the same effect on you as a lead-based consciousness. Another way to see this is the reality of not being able to have pleasure without pain. It's an illusion. It only goes up to a certain point. The pleasure. You can only experience so much pleasure based upon how much pain you've experienced, the roots, the depths you've gone to in order to get all the way up to or out to a level of pleasure. The spiritual teacher or the New Age community is based upon, in general, not saying that they're doing this consciously, but generally, the very nature of the New Age community is to sell you pleasure without pain. This is where the whole love and light perspective, everything is love, everything is light, without any of the other perspectives out there. Having lived in a New Age community, having been around these people, I can attest to this reality being something that is not only existing, but very dangerous. The desire to be blissed out in that pleasure, super dimensional consciousness is not something beneficial to anybody. It's no different than being in a ball of self-destruction. It's just the opposite level of that, but it's the same weight. It's the same destruction. Whether you're tearing yourself apart in the self-destructive nature of the mainstream consciousness or tearing yourself apart from the self-destructive nature of being required to be in a constant state of bliss or pleasure in the New Age hyperdimensional consciousness, it doesn't matter. It's the same thing. You're going from one extreme to another, and they will have the same effect on you that sits in between as the balance, as the center post between both of those extremes. A spiritual teacher is just a manifestation of that one-sided, blissed out New Age consciousness. And this is why people have so much difficulty in New Age communities or in and around gurus and spiritual teachers, is because they're trying to emulate, they're trying to be that spiritual teacher. They're trying to change themselves to be more like them. And they can only be like that spiritual teacher like an actor is the character that they're playing in a movie at best. That trying to be like somebody else ends up being an act that they're playing in a movie. So the movie becomes weight. The character becomes weight. The script within that movie becomes weight. And that's why it's counterproductive. That's why you can see spiritual teachers actually being more of a harm than any good after a certain point. And when you get to that point of realizing that there is a point of counterproduction, it doesn't matter. That point doesn't matter anymore. The very nature, the very existence of their teaching, it doesn't matter how sincere or how well-intentioned they seem to be or are. The very nature of spiritual teaching is ultimately as counterproductive as anti-spiritual teaching. Think about it from this perspective. Just as much as you cannot take your material possessions with you when you pass on from this experience, you cannot take your spiritual teachings with you. Spiritual teachings are no less material than a purse. It's just a more complex illusion in reference to being able to take it with you. Who's to say that this is all for a particular purpose? Who's to say that your spiritual progress, so-called spiritual progress in this reality, is a requirement that your soul needs? See, how many belief systems are in that? You have to believe that there's separation. It's creating the separation. You believe yourself to be a soul separate from the all that is, less than, and then have to take whatever it is with you when you go somewhere. So you have to believe in going somewhere, believe that you're taking something with you, believe that you're less than all that is, believe that the ones who didn't get to do what you're doing are less than, and they're potentially going somewhere else. Now you're getting into the religious belief systems of hell and heaven and hell, purgatory and all this other stuff. Look at all these things that have to become part of your reality that we just take for granted because we no longer have those belief systems anymore. But we don't look at the fact that a lot of the times that not believing in something is actually a part of a belief system. Like the atheist who says that they don't believe in God. The way they identify themselves is based upon a belief in a God. They just don't believe in that belief in a God. But the very nature of not believing in that belief is a form of a manifested belief. The awareness of that is a part of your consciousness. And people wear that. They're saying, "Oh, well, I'm an atheist." So what you are is based upon something that you're not. That what you are-ness based upon something that you're not is validating that which you say doesn't exist. So why even wear that suit? Why even wear that label? Because that's the only thing that's presented. That's the only thing available to people. That's all that they know. This is why I'm saying that in relation to spiritual teachings, those spiritual teachings that are taught by spiritual teachers are at the core of the problems that people have that project them into looking for spiritual teachings. They feel empty, so they look for a spiritual teaching. They feel full because they no longer feel the way they did when they felt empty, when they didn't know about that spiritual teaching. But is that spiritual teaching going to produce any kind of fullness? No. It's only going to put a Band-Aid on the emptiness that those students had before they were presented with the spiritual teaching. And once they find and assume that spiritual teaching, since we're forever evolving, there will be another thing that will be presented in their reality that will start to seed another form of emptiness. People will become empty in a community of synthetic fullness. This is what the New Age community is. This is what the Truther community is. All of these communities in general, it doesn't matter that they don't have any goals or intentions, but in general, the very nature of a community, it will never provide a fullness. The ones without any goals or intentions, deeper than what's on the surface layer, those communities, there will never be a community that will be able to provide for the individual what they're looking for. There will be no teacher that will be able to provide what you're looking for because you don't know what you're looking for. There's nothing for you to look for. The very nature of selling you something to look for is what's causing the problem of people needing to look for something. This is why all spiritual teachers are con artists. They have made a business out of selling you something that you don't need. Like I said, does that mean that all of them are consciously like bad people or trying to get something back from them? No. Compare it to the doctors that work in Big Pharma. Are all the doctors con artists? Are they all crooks and criminals because they work for Big Pharma? No. Many of them are well-intentioned and sincere. But the industry that they work for is designed to maintain sickness and disease. They may be able to heal and help up to a certain degree. But what happens when they prescribe those drugs? How many ODs are a result of doctors prescribing drugs? How many addictive behaviors? How much abuse is contributed to this prescription drug epidemic? What happens to the psychology, the relationships of people because of that Big Pharma mind control program? All of these things that are happening, it's not about the doctors. It's not about the spiritual teachers. It's about the nature of the approach itself. And if they don't let go of those spiritual teachings, just as people caught up in the opioid epidemic, if they don't let go of those prescription drugs, they will develop an addiction. They will become in many ways sometimes worse than what they were before they went to the doctor, before they went to the spiritual teacher. So in closing, these spiritual teachers do not have to be conscious of the fact that they are spiritual con artists. The very nature of their industry is a con. As beneficial as that con may be, up to a certain degree, is the point. It doesn't matter. The spiritual industry is just another form of Big Pharma. is calibrated to exist within the relationship of the individuals and the masses, just the same as the individuals who are in a relationship with big pharma. It has the same thing. People go to these doctors to heal themselves, to feel better. 99% of the problem, the roots of the problem, are never dealt with. But that 1% that they're missing, that gets filled, that 1% gap that gets filled by the tool that's sold by these doctors, these spiritual teachers, since they were 100% empty, that 1% that gets addressed is enough a lot of the time. And you'll have people filling themselves up with 1%, 1%, 1% for the rest of their lives, constantly looking for another 1% and never dealing with the 99%, which is their relationship with how they perceive this reality overall.